Clara Whitmore heard her own mother's voice through the kitchen wall, calm, matter-of-fact, the way a woman discusses livestock prices, saying, "We may simply have to accept that no decent man will want her." She didn't cry. She didn't knock on that door and demand better. She walked straight to the front porch, sat down in the cold dark, and made a decision that would change every single life in that valley forever. And nobody, not her mother, not her sisters, not one soul in Abilene, Texas, saw it coming. If this story already has your heart beating faster, please subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. And when you leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, settle in because part 1 is only the beginning. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Nobody remembered that detail later. Not her mother, not her sisters, not the postman who dropped it in the box with a stack of seed catalogs and a bill from the dry goods store. But Clara remembered. She remembered because Thursday was the day she scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, while her sisters Violet and Beatrice sat in the parlor practicing their singing for the church social. She remembered the particular quality of the late afternoon light coming through the window above the wash basin, thin and pale, the kind of light that makes everything look a little older than it is. She remembered the way her back ached, and her hands were red from the lye soap, and she was thinking not for the first time that this couldn't possibly be the whole of her life. She was 24 years old and she already felt like a woman of 50. She didn't see the letter until supper. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, set it beside Clara's plate without a word, which was how Margaret communicated most things she considered unpleasant. Clara picked it up, turned it over. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and plain. Her name, Miss Clara Whitmore, Abilene, Texas, written in dark ink, each letter deliberate, as if the writer had thought hard before setting pen to paper. "Go on then," her mother said, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "Open it." Violet and Beatrice exchanged a look across the table. Something quick and bright, the look of two people sharing a joke. Clara noticed it, the way she noticed most things, quietly filing it away, saying nothing. She broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages written in the same careful hand. The man's name was Ethan Hayes. He was 36 years old. He ran a cattle ranch in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, 800 acres, a working operation, not a fortune but solid ground. He had been widowed 4 years prior. He had a son 8 years old named Noah. He was writing, he explained with a directness that Clara found almost startling, in response to an advertisement placed on his behalf by his ranch foreman, who had decided without much consultation that the Hayes household needed a woman's management before it fell entirely to ruin. "I will be plain with you," the letter read, "because I have found that plain speaking saves everyone a great deal of misery in the long run. I am not looking for a romantic arrangement. I am looking for a capable woman who is willing to work hard, deal honestly, and help raise a boy who deserves better than what I've been able to give him on my own. I don't expect love. I don't expect you to pretend. I expect fairness, and I will give you the same in return." Clara read it twice. Then she looked up at her sisters. Violet was pressing her lips together very hard, the way she did when she was trying not to laugh. Beatrice had found something fascinating to study on the tablecloth. "Which one of you did it?" Clara said. Not a question, a statement. Silence. "Which one of you answered that advertisement using my name?" Violet broke first. She always did. She didn't have Beatrice's discipline for sustained cruelty. The laugh came out in a burst, helpless hands flying to cover her mouth. "Oh, Clara, don't be dramatic. It was only a bit of fun." "It was my idea," Beatrice said, composed as ever, helping herself to a biscuit. There was an advertisement in the back of the Gazette. "Frontier rancher seeks capable wife, Montana territory." We thought it would be amusing. We didn't think he'd actually write back. We certainly didn't think he'd write back that fast, Violet added, still fighting her laughter. "It's only been 3 weeks. Clara looked at her mother. Margaret Whitmore was cutting her chicken with precise, unhurried movements. "Mother," Clara said. Did you know about this?" Margaret set down her knife. She looked at Clara with the particular expression she reserved for conversations she found tiresome, not unkind exactly, but with the businesslike remove of a woman who had long ago decided that certain problems were best managed rather than solved. "I knew they sent a letter," she said. "I didn't see the harm in it. You're not exactly being courted by anyone else, Clara." The table was very quiet for a moment. "He seems decent enough," Margaret continued, picking up her knife again. "A ranch in Montana is honest work. You're a practical girl. You'd manage." "You'd manage." As if going to live with a stranger in the wilderness of Montana territory was the same as taking a job as a seamstress or a schoolmarm. As if Clara's life were a ledger entry that needed balancing. She looked back down at the letter, at the careful, deliberate handwriting. "I expect fairness, and I will give you the same in return." She thought about this kitchen floor she had scrubbed that afternoon, the floor she would scrub again next Thursday. And the Thursday after that, and every Thursday until she was her mother's age or older, still scrubbing floors in a house where she was invisible, where her future was discussed over supper. Like a logistical problem, where her sisters thought her life was something to play games with. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She didn't say another word about it for the rest of the meal. She wrote back that same night. She sat at the small desk in her room, the smallest bedroom in the Whitmore house, the one that faced the alley rather than the garden, and she wrote by lamplight until nearly midnight. She wrote carefully, the way she did everything. She told Ethan Hayes the truth, that the letter had been sent without her knowledge, that she bore him no ill will for responding, and that she understood if he wished to seek a correspondent who had actually consented to the arrangement. Then she paused, her pen hovering. Then she kept writing. She told him she was 24, that she could keep accounts and manage a household budget, that she had nursed her father through 2 winters of illness before he died, and she was not afraid of hard work or difficult circumstances, that she had never been to Montana, but she was a quick study, that she did not know if she was what he was looking for, but she was willing to find out if he was. She did not tell him she was plain. She figured he'd learn that soon enough, if it came to that. She sealed the envelope before she could change her mind and set it on her windowsill to be mailed in the morning. Then she sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood tree outside, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than hope. The feeling of having done something that was entirely her own. "Tabdin attack." Ethan Hayes wrote back in 11 days. His second letter was shorter than the first. He said he appreciated her honesty. He said the circumstances of the original letter didn't trouble him much. He'd grown up around enough human foolishness to know it came in all varieties. He said if she was serious about the arrangement, he was serious too, and he could send train fare within the month. "I should tell you one more thing," he wrote near the end. "My son Noah is not an easy boy. He's stubborn, and he keeps to himself, and he hasn't warmed to the idea of a new woman in the house. I'm not asking you to fix that. I'm only asking you to be patient with it." Clara read that part 3 times. She thought about what it meant that a man would tell her that up front, would warn her honestly rather than hide the difficulty and let her discover it after it was too late to turn back. She thought about what it said about him, that his first instinct was to be fair rather than persuasive. She wrote back, "I understand. I've never been an easy person either." She told her mother 2 weeks before she left. She didn't ask permission. She was 24 years old, and she had made a decision, and she stated it. The way she had learned through long experience was the only way to survive a conversation with Margaret Whitmore, quickly, plainly, with no opening for debate. "I'm going to Montana," she said. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Hayes. He's sending train fare. I leave on the 15th. Her mother looked at her across the breakfast table for a long moment. "Well," Margaret said finally, "I suppose that's that. I suppose it is." Beatrice looked up from her toast. Something shifted in her expression, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. "Clara," she started. Don't, Clara said. Just the one word. Flat and final. Beatrice closed her mouth. Violet, to her credit, said nothing at all. She stared at her coffee cup with the expression of someone who has played a joke and is only now reckoning with the weight of what the joke set in motion. Clara ate her breakfast. She had a great deal to do before the 15th. She packed 2 trunks. One for practical things, wool skirts, heavy boots, her winter coat, her sewing kit, the ledger books she'd used to track her father's business accounts and had never been able to bring herself to throw away. A medical reference book she'd had since nursing her father, a good kitchen knife, a copy of the Montana Territory land law she'd ordered from the library in Abilene and read cover to cover on 3 separate evenings. The second trunk she packed more slowly. Her mother's old Bible, Margaret had given it to her without ceremony, without sentiment, pressing it into her hands like an afterthought. Her grandmother's quilt. The small tin of pressed wildflowers she'd collected along the creek every spring since she was a girl, because no one had ever told her she couldn't, and she'd never seen a reason to stop. She stood in her room the night before she left and looked at those 2 trunks and understood that they were everything she was taking from one life into another. Everything she had. Everything she was starting with. It wasn't much. But then she had never had much to begin with, and she had always managed. The train station in Abilene was loud and dusty and smelled of coal smoke and horses. Her mother embraced her briefly at the platform, the formal measured embrace of a woman who loved her children in the way she'd been taught, which was to say, competently, but without excess. Violet cried, which surprised Clara a little. Beatrice gave her a hard look that might have been an apology, or might have been something else entirely. Clara had never been entirely sure she understood Beatrice. You be careful, her mother said. I will. Right when you get there. I will. Margaret gave a short nod, the satisfied nod of a woman who has completed a task. Then she stepped back, and Clara picked up her traveling bag, and she walked toward the train. She did not look back. She had learned very early that looking back was a luxury for people who had something worth looking at. 3 days on the train. 3 days of watching the landscape change outside the window. Texas giving way to the great flat plains, the plains rising slowly into something harder and more dramatic, the sky getting bigger, the air getting thinner and sharper, the mountains beginning to appear on the western horizon like the backs of enormous sleeping animals. Clara watched all of it. She ate the food she'd packed from home, rationing it carefully. She slept sitting up, which she had taught herself to do during her father's illness when sleeping lying down had felt like abandonment. She read the land law book again. She thought about what Ethan Hayes had written. I don't expect love. I don't expect you to pretend. She thought about what it felt like to be expected to pretend and how long she had been doing it. Pretending she didn't hear the things her mother said about her future. Pretending she didn't see the looks her sisters exchanged. Pretending she was content with invisibility. She thought about a man who had written to her plainly and asked for plainness in return. She thought that was possibly the most appealing thing anyone had ever offered her. He was waiting at the Missoula depot. She knew him immediately, not because she had a photograph she didn't, but because he was the only man on that platform who looked like he was bracing for something difficult. He stood apart from the other men waiting for the train, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. Not the gesture of a nervous man exactly, more the gesture of a man who was accustomed to hard things and was simply preparing himself for the next one. He was taller than she'd expected. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that was weathered and serious, not handsome in the way the dime novels described cowboys, not pretty, not theatrical, but with a quality that Clara recognized without quite having a name for. The quality of a person who had been through real things and had not been destroyed by them. He saw her step off the train, and he went still for just a moment, just a breath. She watched him look at her. Not the long, obvious look of assessment she had endured her entire life, the kind of look men gave women they were judging and finding wanting. Something different, careful, the look of a person trying to read something honestly. She walked to him, She did not wait to be collected. She stopped in front of him and held out her hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore." He took her hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, and quieter. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said. "But I managed." Something moved in his expression so slight she almost missed it. "I reckon you did," he said. He put his hat back on his head. "Wagon's out front. It's a 2-hour drive to the ranch. You eat on the train." "I did." "Good." He reached for one of her trunks. "Then we'll head straight out." They walked together toward the wagon, not close a foot of space between them. Two strangers moving with the careful courtesy of people who had agreed to a great deal without yet knowing each other at all. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without assistance, and settled her skirts and waited while he loaded her trunks in the back. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses started forward. Neither of them spoke for a while. The road out of Missoula wound north through stands of pine and across a river that moved fast and cold over white stones, and the mountains rose up on every side, until Clara felt for the first time in her life genuinely small. Not in the humiliating way she was small in Abilene, not the smallness of being overlooked and underestimated. Small the way you feel when you are standing in front of something magnificent and you understand that the world is much larger than you knew. "It's beautiful," she said without meaning to. He glanced sideways at her. "Most people say it's overwhelming." Maybe both things can be true. Another of those slight shifts in his expression. He turned back to the road. "My son," he said after a moment. "I meant what I wrote about him." "I know. He's been told you're coming. He's not—" A pause. A man choosing words the way he'd choose footing on bad terrain. "He's not what you'd call enthusiastic." "That's all right," Clara said. "I'm not what most people would call enthusiastic about me either. We might get along fine." Ethan Hayes looked at her again. This time the look lasted a little longer. "Maybe," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the muscle memory of one. As if he'd forgotten for a moment to hold his face in its usual careful stillness. Clara looked back at the mountains. She thought, "This is either the most courageous thing I have ever done or the most foolish." She thought, "I suppose I'll find out." The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk, toward a valley she had never seen, toward a house where a small boy was waiting with stubborn grief, and a rancher was bracing for whatever came next. The air smelled of pine resin and cold water, and something wilder than anything she had ever breathed in Texas. And for all the fear threaded through her, and there was fear she would not pretend otherwise, there was something else underneath it. She was moving toward something. For the first time in her 24 years on this earth, she was moving toward something instead of being left behind by it. And that, she decided, watching the first stars appear above the mountain ridge line was enough to keep going. The ranch house was dark when they arrived. Not the comfortable dark of a place where people were sleeping, the specific hollow dark of a house that had forgotten how to be warm. 2 lanterns burned on the porch, throwing thin yellow light across the front steps, and that was all. No curtain moved in the windows. No sound from inside, except the low creak of the structure settling against the night wind. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake without a word. He climbed down and reached for her trunks before she could protest. Clara stepped down herself and stood looking at the house for a moment. A wide, low-slung building of rough timber, solid and functional. The kind of structure built by a man who intended to stay, but hadn't thought much about what staying would feel like. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. The boy was sitting at the kitchen table. He had not gone to bed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, both hands flat on the tabletop, in the deliberate posture of a child who has decided that posture is a form of armor. He was dark-haired like his father, with serious eyes that moved immediately to Clara, and stayed there, not curious, not welcoming. Measuring. The way a sentry measures an approaching stranger to determine whether they are a threat. "Noah?" Ethan said, setting the trunks down near the stairs. "This is Miss Whitmore." The boy said nothing. Clara did not smile the wide, careful smile of an adult trying to win over a child. She had always hated that smile on other people, the performance of warmth rather than warmth itself. She just looked at him steadily and said, "Hello, Noah." He looked back at her. "You're not what I pictured," he said. Ethan went very still near the door. "What did you picture?" Clara asked. Noah considered this with the grave seriousness of an 8-year-old who takes his own opinions seriously. "Someone prettier," he said. "Like the ladies in Pa's magazines." The silence in the kitchen had a particular quality, the held breath quality of a room waiting for someone to be hurt. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Those ladies wouldn't last a week in Montana," she said, "too busy worrying about their hair." Noah stared at her. Then something shifted in his face, not warmth, not yet, but a fractional recalibration. A child encountering an unexpected answer and filing it away for later examination. "Go to bed," Ethan said to him, voice quiet. "We'll talk in the morning." Noah slid off the chair without argument. He moved past Clara toward the stairs close enough that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder. He didn't look at her again. But at the bottom of the stairs, he paused, one hand on the railing, and said to the wall, to no one in particular, "The room at the end of the hall is the one that doesn't leak." Then he went up. Clara looked at the empty staircase for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan. He was watching the stairs with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between exhaustion and a grief so practiced it had become almost invisible. "He told you which room doesn't leak," he said. "I heard." "He didn't tell the woman before you." He said it without inflection, just a fact, but she heard the weight underneath it. She found out herself in a rainstorm, packed her bags the next morning. Clara absorbed that. "There was a woman before me. 2 years ago, we corresponded for 6 weeks. She came out from Ohio. She lasted 11 days. He crossed the kitchen and lifted the lid on a pot sitting on the back of the stove. Cold beans, she could tell from the smell. "I should have told you in the letters." "Why didn't you?" He set the lid back down. He didn't answer right away, and she had the sense this was characteristic of him, that he thought before he spoke, that silence was not discomfort for him, but simply the space where thinking happened. "Because I didn't want to talk you out of coming," he said finally. "Which means I wasn't being entirely plain with you, and I told you I would be." She looked at him. "Why did you want me to come?" He met her eyes directly. Whatever he was not a man who looked away from difficult questions. "Because Noah told that woman her dress was ugly, and she cried for an hour," he said. "And when you told you what you thought of you tonight, you talked back." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's why you want me here, because I talked back to an 8-year-old. I want you here because I need someone who won't leave the first time this valley shows them what it actually is." He picked up one of her trunks. "I'll take this upstairs, the room at the end of the hall." She watched him go and thought, this is a man who has been abandoned enough times to be afraid of it. She recognized that particular shape of caution. She had worn it herself in a different form for most of her life. She picked up the other trunk and followed him up the stairs. She learned the ranch in the first week, the way she learned everything, methodically, quietly, with her eyes open and her mouth mostly shut. The operation was larger than she'd expected, and in worse shape than the letters had suggested. Not failing, not yet, but tilted the way a table tilts when one leg has been quietly shortening for a long time, and nobody's noticed until the dishes start to slide. The ranch hands were good men who worked hard, but there were 6 of them doing the work of 8, and nobody was tracking the supply accounts with any rigor. Feed costs had drifted 15% over what they should have been. 2 contracts with buyers in Missoula had lapsed and not been renewed, which meant the fall cattle drive had smaller margins than it needed to. The roof of the main barn was developing a problem over the east stall that would be catastrophic by February if nobody fixed it now. She didn't say any of this in the first week. She watched and she listened, and she took notes in the small leather journal she kept in her apron pocket. She cooked breakfast at 5 in the morning because that was when the hands needed to eat. She did not make the mistake of cooking things that required appreciation. No fancy dishes, no laborious preparations designed to demonstrate effort. She cooked food that was hot and plentiful and reliable, and the ranch hands ate it without comment, which was the highest compliment working men gave. Ethan ate with them sometimes and ate alone sometimes, and she learned quickly to read which kind of morning it was. The mornings when his jaw was set and his eyes were focused somewhere past the table, those were the hard mornings, and she gave him silence. The other mornings, the mornings when he came in and said, "Morning, Miss Whitmore," with a fraction more ease in his voice, those were the ones where conversation was possible. Noah was a study in controlled resistance. He was not unkind exactly. He was 8 years old and he had decided that not attaching to her was the safest course, and he pursued that course with the focused determination of a small general. He answered her questions in complete sentences. He thanked her for his meals. He did not leave his belongings in her way or make noise when she was working. He was in every measurable sense perfectly polite, and every morning she could feel him waiting to see if she would leave. On the 5th day, she found him in the barn before school sitting in the corner of the empty east stall, with a battered dime novel open in his lap, reading in the thin morning light. "You'll ruin your eyes," she said. He looked up. "Pa says the same thing." "Your pa's right." She leaned against the stall door. "What are you reading?" He held up the cover. "Jesse James, the Outlaw King of Missouri." "Pa doesn't know I have it," he said with no particular guilt, just information. "I won't tell him," she said. "But next time you want to read before school, the lamp in the kitchen is better." He looked at her with those measuring eyes. "Why would you let me do that?" "Because reading's good, even if the book is nonsense." She pushed off the stall door. Jesse James wasn't actually a king of anything. He was a murderer and a bank robber, and he died broke. Noah blinked. Then, "How do you know?" "I read," she said, and went back to the house. She didn't look back to see his expression. She didn't need to. The first real trouble came on a Wednesday morning, 8 days after her arrival. She was in the kitchen going over the supply ledgers she had asked Ethan's permission before touching them, and he had given it with a look that was partly relief and partly apprehension. The look of a man handing over something he knows is broken and doesn't want to watch be examined when she heard raised voices in the yard. She went to the window without thinking. 2 men on horseback, well dressed by ranch standards, not working clothes. Beside them, Ethan standing with that particular stillness he used when he was keeping himself contained. His arms were at his sides. His hat was pushed back on his head. She had learned already that this was how he stood when he was angry, and working hard not to show it. She went outside. The man on the larger horse was perhaps 50, heavy-jawed, with the kind of face that had learned a long time ago that money was more persuasive than manners. He was talking as she came down the porch steps, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who expected to be heard. "Not asking you to decide today, Hayes. I'm asking you to think reasonably. The offer is fair and you know it." "The offer's been refused," Ethan said. "Twice." "Well, now I'm making it a 3rd time." The man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "A man in your position, managing alone with a boy, to raise, ought to think carefully about what happens if the hard years come. And the hard years always come in this valley." "Is that a warning, Boone?" The man Boone spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical reasonableness. "It's an observation. I've been in this territory 30 years. I know how these things go." Clara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Both riders looked at her. Boone's gaze moved over her with the practiced efficiency of a man cataloging what he saw and assigning it a value and finding it low. "This your wife?" he said to Ethan. "Not to her." "Yes," Ethan said. Boone looked at her a moment longer, then turned back to Ethan with the dismissive ease of a man setting down something that doesn't interest him. "Think about the offer," he said. "I'll come back when you're ready to talk sensibly." He reined his horse around. "Mr. Boone," Clara said. He paused, looked back at her with mild surprise, not at what she'd said, but that she'd said anything at all. "What's the offer?" she said, flat, not a question. A beat of silence. Boone glanced at Ethan. Ethan's expression was unreadable. "Mrs. Hayes," Boone said with the particular patience of a man accustomed to explaining things to people he considers his inferiors, "this is a business matter between your husband and my husband's business is my business," she said. "What's the offer?" Another beat. Boone settled back slightly in his saddle, his expression shifting from dismissive to something more attentive, the attention of a man reassessing what he's looking at. $12,000, he said, for the ranch and river rights. Clara said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about the supply ledgers she'd been reading that morning, about the lapsed buyer contracts, about the roof of the east barn, about the land survey maps she'd found in the bottom drawer of Ethan's desk, and spent an evening studying without telling him she'd done so. She was thinking about where Boone's property lines ran relative to Ethan's river access. She was thinking about the railroad expansion she'd read about in the Missoula paper, the one currently sitting on the kitchen table. She was thinking about what $12,000 for 800 acres with river rights actually meant, given what she now understood about this valley. "That's not a fair offer," she said. "It's not even close." Boone looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "Clara," Ethan said very quietly. "The railroad survey runs through the southern corridor," she said, watching Boone's face. "That makes the river access on this property worth considerably more than what you're offering. You know that. You're counting on Mr. Hayes not knowing it." The yard was very quiet. Boone's expression had gone carefully neutral. The neutrality of a man who has just discovered that the room he thought was empty has someone in it. "You have a sharp wife, Hayes," he said after a moment. His voice was still pleasant, but something underneath it had cooled. "Yes," Ethan said. "I do." Boone looked at Clara for a long, deliberate moment. Then he tipped his hat a gesture that could have been courtesy, and could have been something else entirely. "Good day, Mrs. Hayes," he said. And he rode out with his man behind him, and the sound of the horses faded down the road, and the yard was quiet again. Ethan stood looking at the gate where they'd ridden out. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned to look at her. "How did you know about the railroad survey?" he said. "Your paper," she said. "3 weeks ago. There's an article on page 4 about the expansion route. I've been reading the papers since I got here. You leave them on the table." She paused. "And I found the land survey maps in your desk. I should have told you I looked at those. I'm sorry." He stared at her. Not with anger, she'd braced for anger and found instead something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has just realized without warning that there is someone standing beside him. "The railroad survey," he said. "That's why he keeps coming back." "That's why he keeps coming back," she said. "And that's why the offer's going to stop being polite." He looked out at the empty road again. Then he turned back to her, and she saw something shift in his face, the habitual guardedness giving way just slightly to something more open, more real. "How long have you known this?" he said. 4 days, she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning air, two people who had come to an arrangement and were only just beginning to understand what the arrangement actually was. Then Noah's voice came from the barn doorway. "Is he gone?" They both turned. The boy was standing in the barn door, his dime novel still in his hand, watching the road with dark, serious eyes. "He's gone," Ethan said. Noah looked at Clara. Something in his expression, that careful measuring quality, had shifted slightly. Not warmth, not yet, but the fractional recalibration she had seen on the first night a degree further along. "You knew something he didn't," the boy said. "This time," she said, "you should always try to know something the other person doesn't. It helps." Noah looked at her for a long moment. Then he tucked his book under his arm and walked back into the barn without a word. But he didn't shut the barn door behind him. She noticed that. She turned back toward the house, and Ethan fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked together across the yard, and she thought, Walter Boone is going to come back. She thought, he is going to come back with something sharper than a polite offer. She thought, I need to know everything about this property, every contract, every deed, every acre, and every water right before he does. She had 4 days on him. She intended to use every minute of it. She spent the next 4 days inside the ranch records like a woman on a mission from God. Ethan watched her do it without interfering, which told her something important about him, that he was a man who could recognize competence in someone else and step back from it, even when stepping back didn't come naturally. He brought her coffee at midnight on the second night and set it beside her without a word and went back to bed. She drank it and kept working. What she found in those ledgers and deed boxes and contract folders was not a disaster. It was something more complicated than a disaster. It was a story of a man who was exceptional at the land and the cattle and the labor of ranching, and who had been managing the paperwork the way a person manages a slow leak, patching it here and there, never quite getting ahead of it, never quite falling behind either, but always one bad season away from something irreversible. The land deed was solid. Ethan owned every acre, clear no liens. The water rights were registered correctly and predated Boone's adjacent holdings by 11 years, a fact that Clara wrote in large letters in the margin of her notes, and underlined twice, because it meant that whatever Boone wanted the river access for, he had no legal claim to it, and he knew it. Which meant the only way he could get it was to buy it, or manufacture a reason to take it. She found the clause on the third day. It was buried in a county ordinance document from 1879, the kind of document nobody reads unless they are looking for something specific, or unless they are Clara Whitmore and they have decided that reading everything is the only safe approach. The clause pertained to property seizure in cases of outstanding tax debt. Standard enough. But attached to it in handwriting that matched none of Ethan's records was a supplementary notation referencing the Hayes property by name and indicating a disputed assessment from the previous tax year, an assessment that Ethan had apparently never been formally notified of, and which had been accruing interest quietly for 14 months. She sat with that document for a long time. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the north pasture checking fence line with his foreman, a weathered man named Gil Pruitt, who had been on the ranch for 12 years and spoke approximately 40 words per day. She waited at the pasture gate until Ethan saw her and came over. "I need to show you something," she said. He read the document she handed him. She watched his face while he read, watched the slight tightening around his eyes, the stillness that settled over him like a drop in temperature. "I never received a tax notice," he said. "I know. This assessment is wrong. I paid the county taxes in March. I have the receipt." "Find the receipt," she said. "Today, right now." He looked at her. "You think this is Boone?" "I think this notation wasn't in this file 2 years ago because if it had been, you would have dealt with it. I think someone added it recently. And I think the only person in this county with the connections to manipulate a county assessor's office is the man who's been trying to buy this ranch for 3 years. She paused. "Find the receipt, Ethan. If you have the receipt, the assessment can be challenged. Without it, the outstanding debt is legally enforceable and the property is vulnerable." He handed the document back to her, turned, and walked toward the barn at a pace that was just short of running. She followed him. He found the receipt. It was in a tin box in the bottom of a trunk in the corner of his bedroom, not where a person would keep important financial documents, which told her everything about how he'd been managing his paperwork. But it was there. Dated March 14th, signed by a county clerk named Harold Sims for the full assessed tax amount on the Hayes property. Clara held it in both hands and felt something loosen in her chest. "This is your protection," she said. This means the assessment is fraudulent. But you need to file a formal challenge with the county recorder's office in Missoula before someone moves on it. She looked up at him. How fast can you get to Missoula? Day's ride. Go tomorrow. I can't leave the ranch for a full day. There's Ethan. She said his given name for the first time without thinking about it, and he went quiet. Go tomorrow. I'll manage things here. Gil is here. Noah is here. Go file the challenge and come back. She held out the receipt. This is more important than a day's work. He looked at the receipt in her hand. Then he looked at her. The guardedness was still there. It was probably always going to be there. The scar tissue of a man who'd been left and disappointed enough times to stop trusting things that seemed solid. But underneath it, in the particular quality of his attention, when he looked at her, something had changed in the 2 weeks since she'd arrived. Something had shifted. All right, he said. He took the receipt carefully, the way a person handles something they now understand is valuable. I'll go at first light. She nodded and turned to go. Clara. She stopped. Thank you, he said. Just that. Plain and direct the way he did everything. No performance in it. No politeness. Genuine. She didn't look back because she didn't trust her expression. Get some sleep, she said, and walked out. He left at dawn. At 8 in the morning, the barn caught fire. She heard the horses first, the high, frantic sound that no other animal makes, the sound of pure terror contained in a structure it can't escape. She was in the kitchen, and she was out the back door before she'd finished thinking the word fire, running across the yard, with her skirts bunched in her fists. The east end of the barn was burning. Not a small fire. Not a fire that started from a coal or a kicked lantern. A fire that had been burning for at least 20 minutes before anyone smelled it, which meant it had been set in the interior of the east wall in the section with the new dry timber, where it would take hold and spread before the smoke reached the house. She understood this in the first 10 seconds, and the understanding hit her like a fist to the sternum. Gil Pruitt was already at the barn doors with 2 of the hands pulling the horses out into the yard. Clara ran to them. How many horses still inside? She shouted over the noise. 3, Gil said. East stall won't open, the tracks warped from the heat. She pushed past him through the door. The smoke was dense and moving fast, and her eyes were streaming before she'd taken 5 steps, but she could hear the horses. She could hear exactly where they were, and she went toward the sound. She found the east stall latch by feel. The metal burned her hand. She pulled her sleeve over her palm and worked the latch, and it gave, and the 2 horses inside came out at a run so fast they nearly took her with them. She caught the stall post and held on and let them go past. The 3rd horse was in the next stall. She could barely see him through the smoke. She got the door open and slapped the horse hard on the flank, and he bolted, and then she turned to go back toward the door and realized she couldn't see the door. A hand closed on her arm. Gil, Pruitt eyes streaming a wet cloth over his nose and mouth, pulled her through the smoke with the directness of a man who had decided he was not going to let her die in his barn. They came out through the side door into cold air, and she bent double coughing, and when she finally straightened up, she saw that the east end of the barn was fully engulfed, and there was nothing anyone was going to do about it. Noah was standing at the fence, 8 years old, perfectly still, watching the barn burn. He was still in his school clothes. He hadn't run. She registered that, filed it away. He had just stood and watched with that face that gave nothing away. She walked to him. She stood beside him at the fence and watched the fire with him for a moment without speaking. Then Noah said very quietly, "Boone did this." "I don't know that," she said. "Pa's not here." Another pause. "He always does things when Pa's not here." She looked at the boy's profile, the absolute stillness of him. The way he held his jaw like his father-like stillness was a form of strength. "Are you scared?" she said. "No," he said, then yes. She put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. "Me too," she said. "That's all right." They stood there together until the east wall came down. The damage was catastrophic, and it was calculated. Clara walked through what remained of the east barn 2 hours later with Gil beside her, and she made herself look at everything clearly, the way you have to look at a wound before you can treat it. The east structure was gone entirely. 3 stalls destroyed. 2 months of stored winter hay gone. The tack room with equipment and tools it would take months to replace gone. She did not let herself think about the money. She thought about the timing instead. Ethan was in Missoula filing a legal challenge to a fraudulent tax assessment. The same morning the barn burned. That was not coincidence. Boone had known Ethan would be gone, which meant Boone had eyes on this property. Someone who could tell him when the rancher rode out. "Gil," she said. "Ma'am?" Who knew Ethan was going to Missoula today? Gil was quiet for a moment. She looked at him. He was staring at the burned wall. "Who knew?" she said again. "The hands knew," he said. "All of them. All of them." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly. "All right. Don't say anything to anyone about the timing. Not yet." She turned away from the wreckage. "I need paper, and I need to borrow a horse." Gil looked at her sideways. "Where are you going?" "Into town," she said. "I need to speak to the county sheriff before Boone does." Bull. The sheriff of Bitterroot County was a man named Frank Dalton, 50 years old. Careful and fair in the way of men who had been doing a difficult job long enough to know that fairness was the only thing standing between order and chaos in a territory this size. He listened to Clara for 20 minutes without interruption, which she recognized as a form of respect from a man who didn't give it automatically. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mrs. Hayes, I can't arrest Walter Boone on the basis of timing." "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to document this conversation today with a timestamp, so that when evidence does emerge, and it will emerge, there is a record that I came to you the same morning the fire was set, before Boone had a chance to shape the narrative." Dalton looked at her for a moment with the attentiveness of a man encountering something he hadn't expected. "You've done this before," he said. "Legal process." "I managed my father's affairs for 3 years," she said. "He was ill. I learned what I needed to learn." The sheriff pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and uncapped his pen. When she walked out of the sheriff's office an hour later, she had a signed and time-stamped record of her account, a copy for herself and a copy in the county file, and a promise from Frank Dalton that he would personally inspect the burn site before nightfall. She was halfway back to the horse when she heard his voice. "Mrs. Hayes." She turned. Walter Boone was standing on the opposite side of the street, hat in hand, with the same smile he'd worn in Ethan's yard, the theatrical reasonableness, the performed courtesy. But something was different in his eyes today. The reassessment she'd triggered when she'd spoken up in the yard had hardened into something colder. He had gotten a better look at what she was, and he did not like what he saw. "Heard about the fire," he said, crossing toward her. "Terrible thing. These old barns dry timber one careless coal. Save it," she said. He stopped. The smile stayed in place with an effort she could see now. "Pardon. I said save it." She looked at him steadily. "I know what you did. You know I know. I've just spent an hour in the sheriff's office making sure that when the proof surfaces, it surfaces on the record I made today." She took one step toward him, which was the step that cost her. Her heart was hammering and her hands were cold, and she had never in her life done anything like this, but she took it, and she held his gaze. "Go ahead and send another offer if you want to. Make it twice the last one. It won't matter. We're not selling." Boone looked at her. The smile was gone. What was underneath it was considerably less pleasant. "You are a very foolish woman," he said, quietly, with the specific tone of a man who is deciding rather than warning. "You are not the first person to think that," she said. "They were all wrong." She turned and walked back to her horse, and she did not allow herself to shake until she was well out of town and the road was empty in both directions. Then she stopped the horse and put her face in her hands and breathed long and slow until her hands were steady again. Then she straightened up, picked up the reins, and rode home. Ethan was back when she arrived. He was standing in the yard looking at what remained of the east barn. His back was to her when she rode in, but he turned at the sound of the horse, and when he saw her face, rode dusty, tight-jawed something in her eyes that was equal parts exhaustion and iron. His expression shifted into something she had not seen on him before. Not gratitude, not relief, fear. The specific, helpless fear of a man who has just understood that someone important to him rode into something dangerous while he was gone. "Where have you been?" he said. "Missoula," she asked. "Did you file it?" "I filed it. Clara where?" "Good." She slid down from the horse and handed the reins to the nearest hand. "The sheriff's been out to inspect the burn site. I have a time-stamped record at the county office of my account of the fire and the circumstances. I spoke to Boone in town." She looked at him. His jaw had tightened incrementally with each sentence. "We need to talk about the hands." "Clara." His voice had dropped. "You went into town alone. You spoke to Boone alone." "Yes. He's not a man you—" He stopped. Started again. "He's dangerous. He doesn't—" "I know what he is," she said. "And now he knows what I am." She met his eyes directly. "Are you angry with me?" The question landed and sat there between them. He looked at her for a long moment. The fear was still in his face, doing battle with something else, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, very much like the beginning of understanding. "No," he said at last. "I'm not angry." A breath. "I'm trying to figure out what I am." Noah's voice came from the porch behind them. "I told two of the hands where Pa was going yesterday," he said. They both turned. The boy was sitting on the top step watching them. His voice was perfectly steady. "I didn't think it mattered. I'm sorry." The yard went very quiet. Clara looked at Noah. At the absolute stillness of a child holding himself responsible for something he hadn't known was dangerous, carrying it the way he'd learned to carry hard things, straight-backed, jaw-set, not asking for comfort, but not hiding from the weight of it either. She walked to the porch and sat down beside him on the step. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have been more careful." "You're 8, she said. "You'll be more careful now. That's how it works." He looked at her. His eyes were bright but dry. "Is the ranch going to be all right?" She looked across the yard at the ruin of the east barn, at the cold sky above the mountains, at Ethan still standing where she'd left him, watching them both. "Yes," she said, and she meant it the way she meant everything, not as comfort, not as performance, but as a statement she intended to make true. "Yes, it is." She meant it, and meaning it meant she had to make it true before the ground shifted under them. The next morning, she sat down with Ethan at the kitchen table before the sun was fully up, and she laid out everything she knew: the fraudulent tax notation, the railroad corridor, Boone's property lines, the receipt Ethan had filed in Missoula, the sheriff's report, the timeline of every visit Boone had made to the ranch, going back to the first one 2 years prior. She had written it all out in her ledger, in her precise small handwriting, organized by date and subject, the way she'd organized her father's affairs when the illness had made him unable to think clearly. She turned the ledger so Ethan could read it and watched his face while he did. He read it all the way through without speaking. Then he turned back to the beginning and read parts of it again. "You did all this since you got here," he said. "I started the second week," she said. "After the first time Boone came." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure yet," she said. "I don't say things until I'm sure." He looked up at her. The guardedness that had been a permanent feature of his face since the night she'd arrived had been eroding steadily, the way ice erodes at the edge, almost imperceptible day by day, but unmistakable when you stepped back and looked at the whole picture. "What are we going to do?" he said. Not helplessly, the way a man says it when he is ready to move and is asking which direction. "We're going to fight him in court," she said, "and we're going to win. But we need a lawyer, and we need him quickly, and he needs to be someone Boone doesn't own." "The only lawyer in Bitterroot County is Patrick Weir," Ethan said. "And Weir handles Boone's land contracts." "I know. That's why I wrote to a firm in Helena." She slid a letter across the table. I sent it 4 days ago. I used some of the household money. I should have asked you first. He picked up the letter. Read it. Set it down. You wrote this before the fire, he said. Yes. You were already preparing for this before the fire. Yes. He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for, not on his face, not on anyone's face, not directed at her. It was the expression of a man revising something fundamental. Discovering that the map he'd been using was wrong, and that the actual territory was larger and more interesting than the map had indicated. Clara, he said, and then stopped. The firm in Helena should respond within the week, she said, because she did not know what to do with the way he'd said her name, and the safest thing was to keep moving. In the meantime, I need you to pull every deed, every water rights document, every survey record you have, and let me organize them. If this goes to a county hearing, we need everything in order. He nodded. All right. He stood. Then he stopped beside the table and said without looking at her, My wife, my first wife. Eleanor, she used to say I was impossible to help, that I made everything harder than it needed to be by trying to carry it alone. A pause. She was right. Clara said nothing. She understood this was not a simple statement. I've been doing the same thing since she died, he said, trying to carry it alone. He picked up the ledger and handed it back to her. I reckon I can stop now. He walked out to the barn, and Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, with her hands flat on the wood, and she told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry, and she did not cry, and then she opened the ledger and got back to work. But the response from the Helena firm came in 6 days. The attorney's name was James Calloway, 40 years old, based on his letter's tone, a man who chose his words with the economy of someone accustomed to billing by the hour, but who also, reading between the sentences, found this case genuinely interesting. He had reviewed the materials Clara sent with her initial letter. He believed the fraudulent tax notation was prosecutable. He believed the water rights documentation was solid. He would come to Bitterroot County within the fortnight. He came in 12 days. Clara had the documents organized and waiting. She sat in on the meeting without asking permission. Ethan didn't suggest she leave, which told her everything about how the last 3 weeks had changed things. Calloway was a compact, precise man with a good suit and the kind of intelligent eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. He read through Clara's organized files with a steadily deepening attention, and at the end he looked across the table at both of them, but then specifically at Clara and said, Who put this together? I did, Clara said. You have legal training? No, she said. I have a father who was sick for 3 years and a talent for organization. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to Ethan. Your wife is either going to save this ranch or she's missed her calling by about 30 years, he said. Either way, I believe we have a strong case. Ethan looked at Clara. The corner of his mouth moved. Both, he said. Probably both. The county hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Walter Boone made 2 more moves. The first was a revised offer, $18,000, delivered by his own attorney, a thin man named Greer, who had the apologetic manner of someone who knew what he was participating in and had made his peace with it. Clara received Greer at the door because Ethan was in the south pasture and she saw no reason to wait. Tell Mr. Boone the answer is still no, she said, and tell him we'll see him at the county hearing. Greer looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. Mrs. Hayes, I'd encourage you to consider. I have considered it, she said. No. She closed the door. The second move was worse. 3 days before the hearing, Noah didn't come home from school. She was at the kitchen window when she realized the afternoon had gone past the time the boy usually came up the road. She waited 10 minutes, which was the limit of what she was capable of waiting, and then she went to find Ethan. She didn't have to find him. He was already coming toward the house from the barn at a pace that told her he'd realized the same thing. He's not on the road, Ethan said. I know. They looked at each other for 1 second. The fear between them was immediate and physical. She felt it in her chest like a dropped stone. "I'll ride toward town," he said. "You stay." "I'm coming with you," she said. "Clara." "I'm coming with you," she said again, and her voice left no room, and he did not argue. They found Noah 20 minutes down the road, sitting on a fence post outside the old Miller property, eating an apple with the composure of a boy who has no idea he has caused anyone alarm. Beside him, also sitting on the fence, was a man she didn't know, perhaps 60, heavyset, with a friendly face, and the clothes of someone who worked indoors. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and was down from it before the wheels had fully settled. "Noah." His voice was perfectly controlled, the specific control of a parent who is terrified and furious, and has decided terror is private. "Get in the wagon." "Pa, this is Mr. Wagon, now." Noah looked at his father's face and got in the wagon without another word. The stranger on the fence post raised both hands with an expression of earnest alarm. "Mr. Hayes, I can explain. I work for Mr. Boone. I only wanted to have a friendly—" "You stopped my son on a public road," Ethan said. His voice had dropped to the register that Clara had learned meant something had passed beyond the threshold of what he was going to manage quietly. "You talked to him without my knowledge. You tell Walter Boone that if anyone from his operation comes near my son again, the county hearing will be the least of his problems." The man was off the fence and backing away before Ethan had finished the sentence. Ethan turned and walked back to the wagon. He climbed up. He picked up the reins. For a full quarter-mile, no one in the wagon said anything. Then Noah said in a very small voice, "He just asked me questions about the ranch." "What questions?" Clara said carefully. "About the papers. Whether you'd been working on papers. Whether Pa had gone to Missoula." A pause. "I didn't tell him anything." "Good," Ethan said. Still controlled. Still tight. "Pa?" Noah's voice was different now, stripped of the composure he usually kept around him like a coat. "I'm sorry. I got off the road to look at a hawk, and he was just there, and he seemed nice, and I—" "You don't have to apologize," Clara said. She reached across and put her hand briefly on Noah's knee. "You did nothing wrong. You didn't know. But I should have—" "Noah." She waited until he looked at her. "You're 8 years old. There are grown men in this county who can't see through Walter Boone. You are not responsible for that." She held his gaze. "You're all right. We're all going home. That's what matters." The boy looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked the way his father's did when he was holding something in. Then, very quietly, he said something she was not prepared for. "Okay, Ma." Not Miss Whitmore. Not ma'am. Not the careful nothing he'd been calling her for 6 weeks. Ma. She turned to face the road before he could see her expression. Beside her, she felt Ethan go very still, the specific stillness of a man who has heard something that has reached him somewhere undefended. Nobody said anything else until the ranch gate. And that was all right. Some things didn't need words around them. Some things needed to just be allowed to exist in the air unexamined until both people had the steadiness to look at them directly. The night before the county hearing, Boone came to the ranch. He came alone, which was either courage or arrogance or both. And he came late, past 9 o'clock, when the hands were in the bunkhouse and Noah was in bed. Clara heard the horse and went to the window, and then she went to the gun rack on the wall, without stopping to think about it, and she took down the Winchester that Ethan kept loaded and ready, and she checked the load the way her father had taught her 20 years ago, and she walked to the front door and opened it. Boone was at the porch steps. He'd been drinking. She could see it in the way he was holding himself, the exaggerated deliberateness of a man who is not as steady as he wants to appear. His hat was pushed back on his head. His expression had abandoned entirely the theatrical reasonableness she'd come to expect. What was underneath it was uglier and more honest. "Where's Hayes?" he said. "Behind you," Ethan said. Boone spun. Ethan was coming from the side of the house. He'd heard the horse too had come from the other direction. He stopped 10 feet from Boone with his arms at his sides. "You've got no business on this property at this hour," Ethan said. I came to make one last reasonable conversation, Boone said. The word reasonable in his mouth at this hour, with the smell of whiskey carrying across the yard, was nearly absurd. Tomorrow, that hearing is going to cost both of us time and money, and the hearing is going to cost you your reputation, Clara said from the porch. Boone turned and looked at her. At the rifle in her hands held across her body, not raised but present. The message was plain enough. His face went through several things in rapid succession. She watched them happen, the calculation, the anger, the reassessment, and finally underneath everything, the thing that powerful men least expect to feel when they look at a woman they've decided is negligible. Fear. Not of the rifle, of her. You have no idea what you've done, he said to her. Just to her, like Ethan wasn't standing 10 feet away. I've organized 6 weeks of documentation into a legal case that James Calloway of Helena is presenting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she said. I've filed a fraud complaint with the county recorder's office regarding the tax assessment notation that was added to our file without notification or legal basis. I've provided the sheriff with a full account of the fire, the timing of which correlates specifically with my husband's absence, which was known to members of your operation. She let that sit for a moment. I know exactly what I've done, Mr. Boone. The question is whether you understand what you've done. The yard was very quiet. Ethan took one step forward. Just one. Get off my land, he said. Quiet, final. The voice of a man who has reached the exact limit of what he will tolerate and is not going to repeat himself. Boone looked at him. Then he looked back at Clara on the porch. And the thing that moved through his expression, then she filed it away, because she knew she would need to remember it. The look of a man who has found the edge of something and understood too late that the ground on the other side belongs to someone else. He turned his horse and rode out. When the sound of the horse had faded completely, Clara lowered the rifle. Her arms were trembling slightly. She had not noticed that while he was there. Ethan came up the porch steps. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, at her hands, at the rifle, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached out and took the rifle from her gently, and then he kept hold of her hand after the rifle was gone. His hand was warm and rough and steadier than hers, and he held it the way you hold something you are relieved to find unbroken. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was him and he deserved plain speaking, my hands won't stop shaking. Mine too, he said. He turned their joined hands slightly so she could see his, the faint tremor there. Proof. She looked at that, at his honesty, at the deliberate exposure of it, and she felt something move in her chest that had no name she'd been given permission to use yet. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he said. He let go of her hand. He went inside to check on Noah. She stood on the porch in the cold dark and breathed the Montana air, pine and cold water and something wilder, and she thought about tomorrow, and she was not afraid of it. She had built the case. She had the documents. She had Calloway. She had the receipt and the water rights and the sheriff's report and 6 weeks of quiet, meticulous work that no one had seen her do because she'd done it without asking anyone to notice. She had stopped waiting to be seen. And tomorrow, whether Walter Boone understood it or not, everyone in Bitterroot County was going to see exactly what Clara Hayes was made of. She was awake before the alarm. Not because she couldn't sleep. She'd slept 4 solid hours, which was enough, but because there was a quality to the silence before dawn that demanded attention. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to the ranch breathe around her. The creak of the house, the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the rebuilt west stall. The wind off the mountains steady and cold and indifferent to what any of them were facing in 7 hours. She got up. She dressed carefully. She put on the best skirt she'd brought from Texas. Dark wool, well-cut, not fashionable, but authoritative, and she pinned her hair with more precision than usual. Not because she thought appearances would determine anything in that hearing room, but because she understood that how a person carried themselves told the room something before they said a single word, and today she intended to tell the room everything before Calloway opened his mouth. When she came downstairs, Ethan was already at the table with coffee. He looked up at her. He didn't say anything about how she looked, and she was grateful for that. She would have trusted it less if he had. Instead, he just pushed the second cup toward her and said, "Calloway sent a rider last night. He's already in town." "Good," she said. She sat down. She drank her coffee. Noah came down 10 minutes later in his school clothes, carrying his boots in his hand. He stopped when he saw them both at the table. "I'm coming," he said. A statement, not a request. Ethan looked at him. "School." "I'm coming," Noah said again. The jaw set. The stillness. His father's stubbornness in his father's exact posture, 8-year-old edition. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his son. Then he looked at Clara with an expression that said plainly that he recognized he was outnumbered and had made his peace with it. "Sit down and eat something," he said to Noah. "We leave in an hour." The county courthouse in Bitterroot was a wooden building that smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the particular solemnity of a place where people came to resolve things they couldn't resolve anywhere else. The hearing room held perhaps 40 people. By 9 o'clock, it held 38, which in a county this size meant that word had traveled and that everyone who had an opinion about Walter Boone, and there were many she was learning, had found a reason to be present. Boone was already there with Greer and 2 other men Clara didn't recognize. He did not look at her when she came in. That told her something. A man who ignores you entirely is a man who has decided you are the primary threat in the room. Calloway met them at the door. He was composed and precise and smelled of coffee, and he shook Ethan's hand and then turned to Clara. "Everything's in order," he said. "The recorder's office confirmed the notation discrepancy this morning. The original file and the altered file are both in evidence." He paused. "You were right about the handwriting. It isn't a county clerk's hand. The assessor's office is distancing themselves from it already." "Boone's side did that faster than he expected," Clara said. "Yes." Calloway's expression was the closest she'd seen him come to satisfaction. When men like Boone build their schemes on intermediaries, the intermediaries tend to have self-preservation instincts. He gestured toward the front of the room. "Shall we?" They sat. Noah sat between his father and Clara, straight-backed and serious, holding his hat in his lap the way his father held his hat when he was preparing for something difficult. Sheriff Dalton was present. He caught Clara's eye across the room and gave her a slight nod. The nod of a man confirming that the record he'd made on the morning of the fire was in order, that his inspection of the burn site was in order, that he was prepared to speak to what he'd found. The county judge was a woman named Ruth Abernathy, 60 years old, iron-haired, with the expression of a person who had heard every variety of human foolishness and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She called the hearing to order with a single strike of her gavel and looked out at the room with the no-nonsense attention of a woman who intended to be elsewhere by noon. "We're here on the matter of Hayes versus the county assessor's office with ancillary complaint filed against Walter Boone regarding alleged fraudulent modification of county records," she said. "Mr. Calloway, you may proceed." So, Calloway was good. Better than good, he was methodical and clear. And he had the documents, and documents Clara had learned from her father's years of business dealings were the only thing that reliably defeated a powerful man's version of events. He laid it out in sequence, the original tax assessment correctly paid in March receipt in evidence. The altered notation appearing in the county file sometime in the following 6 months in handwriting that did not match any county clerk on record. The timeline of Boone's purchase offers beginning 3 months after the railroad expansion route was filed with the territorial government, a filing that Ethan had never been notified of, despite the fact that the corridor ran through the southern edge of his property and directly along his river access rights. Every few minutes, Clara watched something shift in the room. The sound of people listening changing in quality, the way a room sounds different when people go from passive hearing to active understanding. Boone's attorney Greer cross-examined with the focused desperation of a man trying to find footing on a slope that kept giving way. He challenged the handwriting assessment. Calloway produced an affidavit from a Helena document examiner. He challenged the timeline of the railroad filing. Calloway produced the official territorial record with its date stamp. He challenged the relevance of the purchase offers. Judge Abernathy stopped him there with a look that could have stripped paint. "Mr. Greer," she said, The relevance of the purchase offers is that they establish motive. I have the motive, the method, and the documentation. What I would appreciate is your client's explanation for the notation." Greer turned to Boone. Boone sat very still. And then the door at the back of the room opened, and a man walked in, whom Clara had never seen, heavy-set, pale, with the look of someone who has made a decision that cost him something. He walked up the center aisle and handed an envelope to the bailiff and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "I'd like to speak if the court will allow it. My name is Harold Sims. I was a county clerk until last week." He stopped. He looked at the envelope in the bailiff's hand, then at Boone, and something in his face settled into resolution. "Mr. Boone paid me $400 to add that notation to the Hayes file. I have the bank record. I kept it because I'm a coward who wanted insurance, and I've been awake for 6 days straight, and I'd like to stop being a coward now if it's not too late for it to matter." The hearing room erupted. Judge Abernathy's gavel came down 3 times. Clara did not look at Boone. She looked at Noah, who was watching Harold Sims with his mouth slightly open, the specific expression of an 8-year-old witnessing something he will remember for the rest of his life. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder once briefly. He looked up at her. She gave him a small nod that said, "Watch. Remember, this is what happens when you do the work and you wait." He nodded back, gravely, seriously, as if they had made an agreement. Judge Abernathy ruled before noon. The fraudulent notation was struck from the county record. The tax assessment complaint was dismissed with prejudice. Boone was referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud and potential arson, the arson finding contingent on Sheriff Dalton's ongoing inquiry, which Dalton confirmed was proceeding with new evidence. Greer was noticeably pale. Boone sat motionless for a long moment after the gavel fell, and then he stood and walked out of the room without looking at anyone, and the 2 men he'd brought with him followed, and that was all. It was over. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just over. The way real things end, not with thunder, but with paperwork and a gavel and a judge already gathering her files to move on to the next matter. Calloway shook Ethan's hand, and then Clara's. "Finest case preparation I've seen in 15 years of practice," he said to her quietly. "If you ever want honest work in Helena, Mrs. Hayes, I'll make a position for you." "I have honest work," she said. He smiled, a real one, brief and genuine. "That you do." The room was clearing around them. Neighbors who'd watched from the gallery were filing out. Some of them stopped to nod at Ethan. A few of the older ranchers shook his hand, and Clara noticed something she had not expected. A number of them, men and women, both looked at her too when they did it. Not past her, not through her, at her. With the specific acknowledgement of a community recognizing that something has been done on its behalf. Mrs. Elspeth Tarrant, who ran the dry goods store and had been one of the louder voices in the whisper about the mail-order bride, stopped directly in front of Clara on her way out and said, "That was well done, Mrs. Hayes. Nothing more. Just that." And then she walked on. Noah, who had heard this, looked up at Clara with an expression that for the first time contained something uncomplicated. No measurement, no wariness. Just a child looking at a person he was proud of. "She doesn't say that to hardly anybody," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Come on, let's go home." They were halfway back to the ranch when Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the road. Not because of anything in the road. No obstacle, no reason. He just stopped. He sat holding the reins for a moment, looking ahead, and then he set the reins down and turned to look at her directly. "I need to say something," he said. Noah, wedged between them, became very interested in his hat. "All right," Clara said. "When I answered that first advertisement," Ethan said, "I told myself I was being practical, that I needed someone capable, and I was offering fair terms, that it wasn't—" He stopped, searched, that it didn't have to be more than an arrangement. His jaw worked the way it did when he was forcing himself through something difficult by sheer determination. "I was lying to myself. I was scared. I'd been scared since Eleanor died, and being practical felt safer than being anything else." Clara said nothing. She waited. "You've been here 7 weeks," he said. "In 7 weeks you figured out what Boone was doing before I did. You went into town alone and faced him down. You built a legal case from the contents of my desk drawer. You pulled 3 horses out of a burning barn." He looked at her steadily. "And last night when you were standing on that porch with the rifle and your hands were shaking—" "My hands weren't shaking until after," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." He took a breath. "I thought I was doing you a favor when I offered this arrangement. I thought I was giving you something, a home, security, a practical solution." Something moved through his expression, the old guardedness lifting, the scar tissue of 4 years of loss giving way. "I had it exactly backwards. You came here with nothing, and you gave us everything. And I don't know what to do with that, except say it plainly, because you told me in your first letter that plain speaking was what you wanted." The road was quiet. The mountains were white at their tops, and the sky was enormous above them. "Ethan," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been in love with you since the morning you told Walter Boone his offer wasn't fair, and you knew why it wasn't fair, and you weren't afraid to say so in his face. Maybe before that." He picked up the reins again, the gesture of a man who has said what he needed to say and doesn't know what to do with his hands now. "I don't expect you to. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it plainly." Clara looked at him, at the careful, serious face of a man who had been honest with her from the first letter and had not stopped being honest since not even when honesty was the harder choice. She thought about the girl in Abilene who had scrubbed floors while her future was discussed over supper, like a ledger problem. The girl her mother had called practical, plain, manageable. The girl her sisters had played games with because her life seemed like something that could be moved around without consequences. She thought about what it felt like to sit beside a child on a porch and say, "Yes, it will be all right," and mean it not as comfort, but as intention. What it felt like to walk into a sheriff's office and a courtroom and a burning barn and come out the other side with something intact that she'd never quite known she was protecting. She thought about the word plain, how long she'd carried it like a verdict, and when exactly it had started to feel instead like a form of honesty she was proud of. "Ethan," she said, "I left Texas on a train to marry a stranger in a territory I'd never seen, because it was the first time in my life someone chose me, even if they chose me by accident." She held his gaze. "It stopped being an arrangement for me about 3 days after I got here. When you brought me coffee at midnight without saying anything and went back to bed." She paused. "That's when I knew what kind of man you were." He looked at her. The reins were still in his hands. He was very still. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I've been trying to figure out the right moment to be plain about it. I reckon this is it." Noah made a sound beside her, a small, suppressed sound quickly controlled. She glanced down at him. He was staring straight ahead, with enormous dignity, and the pink ears of a child, trying very hard not to exist in this particular moment of the conversation. "Noah?" Clara said. "Ma'am, you can stop pretending you're not listening." A pause. Then from Noah, with complete and magnificent seriousness, "I think you should probably kiss her paw." Ethan looked at his son. Then he looked at Clara. Then he laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind of laugh that a man produces when he has forgotten for a moment to hold everything carefully. It changed his face entirely. She had not heard him laugh like that before, and she thought she would like to hear it every day for the rest of her life. He reached across Noah and took her hand. "That's the first sensible thing you've said all week," he told his son. "I say sensible things all the time," Noah said with dignity. "Nobody listens." Clara was laughing now too. She couldn't help it. She held Ethan's hand and laughed in the cold Montana air, with the mountains all around them, and a boy wedged between them, complaining about not being listened to, and she thought, This is what it was supposed to feel like. This whole time, this is what I was supposed to find. The barn was rebuilt by spring. The whole community helped, not because anyone asked them to, but because that was how things worked in the Bitterroot Valley when you'd earned your place, and Clara Hayes had earned hers in a courthouse on a November morning in front of 40 witnesses. Men showed up with timber and tools, and their older sons and the women brought food and helped where they could. And in 4 days, the east barn stood new and solid and smelling of fresh-cut pine. Walter Boone was indicted by the territorial attorney in February. He sold his property the following spring to settle his legal debts and left Bitterroot County without ceremony, and no one who remained could honestly say they missed him. Harold Sims, who had walked into that hearing room with an envelope and a decision that cost him his job and his reputation and gave him back his sleep, eventually found work at a law office in Helena. Calloway hired him. Clara thought that was just about right. She started teaching at the Bitterroot School in January. The previous teacher had moved east in the fall, and when the school board approached her somewhat tentatively, as if they expected to be refused, she said yes before they'd finished asking. She taught arithmetic and reading and the land law of Montana Territory, which she considered non-optional because a person who didn't understand the legal ground they stood on was a person who could be taken advantage of, and she had seen enough of that for one lifetime. Noah came home from school one afternoon in March and found her at the kitchen table grading arithmetic papers, and he dropped his bag in the doorway, which she had asked him not to do approximately 30 times, and said, "Mrs. Calloway told her daughter you're the best teacher in the county." "Mrs. Calloway is very kind," Clara said without looking up. "She said you're better than the man who was here before." "That's less impressive. He used a 12-year-old reader for the older students." Noah sat down across from her and pulled an apple from his coat pocket. He ate it for a moment. Then, "Ma." She looked up. He was watching her with those serious dark eyes. Not the watchful waiting eyes of the boy who had sat straight-backed at the kitchen table on her first night measuring her for trustworthiness. Something easier. Something that had been building quietly since a porch step in November and had simply gradually become the way things were. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to say it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back down at her papers. "Bag off the floor, please," she said. He sighed extensively and picked up the bag, and she kept her expression neutral until he'd taken it to the hook by the door, and then she let herself smile at the arithmetic paper she was marking because there was no one to see it, and she was allowed. That evening, Ethan came in from the south pasture and found her at the stove, and Noah at the table, with his Jesse James novel. She had long since stopped pretending she didn't know about it, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment, the way he sometimes did, just stood there, looking at the kitchen, at the light and the warmth, and the two of them in it. She had learned to recognize that pause. It was the pause of a man who had lived in a cold house for 4 years, and still some evenings needed a moment to confirm that the warmth was real. She did not remark on it. She just said, "Wash up, supper's ready." He came in and washed up and sat down, and they ate together, the three of them at the table in the warm kitchen with the wind off the mountains pressing against the windows, and they talked about the south fence and Noah's arithmetic test, and whether the Hendersons' new dog had been the one getting into the feed room, and it was ordinary, unremarkably ordinary, the specific ordinary of a family that has settled into itself and found that it fits. After, when Noah was in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Ethan found her on the porch. He came to stand beside her close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and they looked out at the land together. Their land, the land they had fought for, and kept the land that had asked everything of both of them and had given back more. "Clara," he said. "I'm glad your sister sent that letter." She thought about Violet and Beatrice, about the joke that wasn't a joke, the game that had not gone the way anyone expected. She thought about the thin, pale light in the kitchen in Abilene, and a letter arriving on a Thursday, and a woman on her hands and knees who had believed until that moment that invisibility was simply the condition of her life. "So am I," she said. She meant it absolutely. The woman who had arrived in Montana with 2 trunks, and no one's permission, and nothing to prove except everything that woman had stopped waiting for the world to decide she was worth something. She had simply gotten up and organized the documents and spoken plainly and done the work and stayed, and she had found on the other side of all of it that she had never been unwanted. She had only been surrounded for a season by people too afraid of their own smallness to recognize the size of what was standing right in front of them. She was not afraid of her size anymore. She was Clara Hayes, and she had saved a ranch and raised a boy and loved a good man honestly and changed every life she'd touched in the doing of it. And she had done all of it simply by refusing quietly, completely, without apology, to be anything less than exactly who she was.